You're listening to Fellow Travellers with East of Moon. Welcome to Fellow Travellers, a podcast from East of Moon. We are an organisation that studies, experiments with and develops the ways in which communities create together. My name is Josie Ann Gatens, and in this episode I spoke with Ægir Sindri Bjarnason, who runs a literally underground music venue, R6013, in a basement in the middle of Reykjavik. We discussed how the space and the community it serves have changed and evolved over time, and the importance of having a home for experimental and grassroots culture.
Good to learn new things.
It is good to learn new things. Yeah. Are you ready whenever?
Yeah.
Cool.
Sure. You just lead the way.
Ægir, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Josie.
Can you just start by at the beginning? Just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and the venue that you are involved in running.
I've played drums since I was a kid and been involved in the music scene since I was a teenager. I started playing in bands when I was maybe 12 and quite actively when I was 15 and never really stopped since then. I mostly play drums. I've been in a ton of bands. And I kind of grew up in the punk and metal scenes. But I somehow I've usually been in bands that don't fully belong to either. So I've kind of always been, in between scenes in some sense. But when I was, 15 and starting to play shows with all of my bands, there were a bunch of spaces where we were welcome, even being teenagers. I can remember at least 4 different venues that had regular all-ages shows that you could book quite easily. But a couple of years later, those bands were still going, but most of those spaces had shut down or just weren't being used as actively anymore. So then there was a long period, maybe 10 years or so, where there were almost no... there would be an all-ages show or two most years, but not much more than that. And then in 2017, I was playing in a band that kind of didn't like playing stages and was quite interested in doing shows in spaces that weren't typically used for that kind of thing. And then at some point we lost our rehearsal space and moved into my basement and just kind of slowly started. It was mostly being used for storage at that point. And then we just slowly started kind of pushing all of the other things out. We had set up in this corner in the end of the space, and then we slowly took over the space and started opening it up for shows. And this was at a time where there were a few bars that would have, Hurra was still open and Gaukurinn and a few others. So there were shows, but none of them were open for all ages, which I always found unfortunate, though I had, gotten to the age of being allowed to attend shows anywhere. But we did one show there before we moved in, and then after we moved in, we just booked a last-minute show for a band from the UK that was visiting. And immediately after that show, people started asking me, so what's your basement called and how do I book a show there? Because it was just I don't know, there was a great need for these kind of like small open spaces at the time.
And was it well attended, the first show?
Not super. I mean, it was like booked a day in advance, I think, and maybe 15, 20 people showed up or something. But that's still enough to it's something. And just like people seeing, oh, there's a show happening in a new spot that I haven't been to a show before.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something that I could use for the next thing I want to book. And out of that grew this space that is called R6013 or R6013.
It's a great name.
Yeah.
And it's from a number plate?
Yeah, it's an old license plate from a car that belonged to previous owners of the house. It's the house that I grew up in. My family has lived there since I was less than a year old. And the license plate was just there in the garage, and at some point we used it and like screwed it on the back door to close a hole in the door. And there's a name. It was already labeled many years ago.
Humble beginnings, but
yeah,
that's kind of also, the space. It's very
and like it was labeled with that license plate when I was 12, playing in my first band with my brothers and with my schoolmates.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was still a garage, but then later on the garage was torn down, and there was we built this addition to the house to so that it would fit me and my two brothers. And this space in the basement was always intended for us to make music in, which we did in whatever space was available in the house. First it was the garage, and then it was my mom's bedroom, and later we just had that room, but the bedroom was quite, I don't know, sound spreads.
Mm-hmm.
So some neighbors in the area eventually asked us to stop, and we did like rehearsal space hopping for a few years until the basement was I don't know, until we lost the last space, and then we just kind of had to make the basement work. And it was very raw in the beginning. It was just, we painted the walls, but it was just all like bare concrete, and there was no bathroom for the first 6 months or something, so people had to go into the house to use the bathroom. But eventually we fixed that up, and then just like ever since then it's been I don't know, like gradually improving step by step with every year, and now it's this like tiny basement kind of looks like a proper venue, and it's very well equipped, and but that's been a very gradual change.
I've been to see some really wonderful shows there, so I can attest to its value and importance personally. But I do really like the fact that there's something so charming about being in someone's basement.
Yeah.
And the first time I heard about the space, I was interviewing someone for a piece for a local newspaper, and they were talking about like, oh yeah, and then we're going to go and sing karaoke in my friend Ægir's basement. And I was like, okay, like not realizing that at that point, having just moved here, that it wasn't just a basement, you know. But it is also still someone's house, and you don't live in that house anymore, but your mum still does, and other family members still do. What were some of the challenges in setting up a venue space? I mean, we've already talked about like the neighbours having something to say about music and stuff, but for turning it into a proper venue in a domestic property, were there challenges with that?
Not really, to be honest.
Okay.
But I've also, I think, well, when I first started doing this, I went around the neighborhood and knocked on doors and to tell people we were doing a show there, and just, you know, this is the time, and just to let them know that there would be something happening and to come talk to us if there was anything. But I hardly found any permanent residents in the area. It was all like, I think almost every single house in the immediate vicinity was being used for short-term rental for tourists.
Wow. I mean, that's telling for a lot of reasons as well.
Yeah. That has changed since then. But like that's what I found out then, and figured like, well, they can put up with it for, the...
One night.
Yeah. A couple of days that they're staying there. But we've always made sure to not be allowed too early or too late. And I think that's key to how long it's lasted and how like the neighbors really don't mind. And I get way more positive feedback than from the people in the area and than anything else. And like I run into people on the street that live down the street, and they saw me on TV on some interview and were just commenting on how cool it is that we're doing this, and it's nice to have some like life in the area. But also I think like honestly it doesn't really bother anyone. It might be for the people on the other side of the wall. I think there's an apartment on the other side of the back wall. It might be tricky if someone's trying to take a nap, and that's happened once or twice where like someone that's staying there comes and asks how long this rehearsal is going to go on. And we've also just tried to be respectful of our neighbors and like there's a building next door that houses I think it's called the Theosophical Society. And they have meetings and lectures and like meditation sessions, and we just try to arrange things so that we're not being loud and when they have stuff going on. And if we forget that, they just come and tell us and we stop. And so I think like, yeah, it's just a question of like being respectful to your next door neighbors and like accommodating their requests, but they've also been very understanding and like not minded us much, not so that I've heard anyway.
But what about, I mean, other people using the house as well? I mean, like other family members. And
they can they can watch TV in the living room when there's a show going on, and our kids can sleep. Well, like I still lived there for the first 5 years or something of doing these shows, and I would put my daughter to sleep like in the room right above the venue and go downstairs and have a rehearsal or a show or whatever, and she slept fine. And the kids come to shows quite often, and they just get to grow up with live music, which is cool.
Yeah.
And everyone is happy, and my mom is super supportive, and she just enjoys sitting on the steps outside and watching the people, and often I'll come up after the show is finished, and she'll tell me what stood out to her. Like she hears like some bass line, or often has thoughts about the music that's going on, but it's generally quite appreciative and just loves having life in the house.
It's great, and it really feels like that. Like you can feel the spirit of the house. I mean, I think your family's relationship with it is one of the things that sets the tone for it feeling like a community rather than just an individual's, passion project, or
right.
Or just a kind of cold venue with no kind of atmosphere or life to it.
Yeah.
And also when you're talking about, having your kids there, I wanted to ask you about this because it's like you say, this is an all ages space, and that's obviously quite important to you. Why was that a priority in terms of thinking about creating a venue?
I think mostly it comes from like I was 14 or 15 when I started playing shows, and I had spaces that were open to me and my friends, and where we could go to shows, and that's where, I don't know, I felt at home, and that's kind of where I grew up, in those spaces as a kind of awkward teenager that didn't necessarily connect with a lot of my a lot of my like immediate peers. So that's where I found my community, and yeah, that's pretty much it. And like going to shows that were set up in the corner of some random cafe in the downtown, and the band just played on the floor, and there's no barrier between band and audience, and it's just kind of everyone is in it together. And I don't know, that's just that's the world that I got to know when in my formative years, and I kind of think that's just how things are supposed to be, and I think those spaces are necessary, and that's also when I started playing shows. The band that I was in, we were quite young in the scene, and like a lot of the scene they were a few years older than us, and we were kind of the new young kids on the scene. And for a long time, after all of these spaces shut down, we didn't really see new bands with young people.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure there were kids playing music somewhere.
In their garages somewhere.
Or in whatever rehearsal spaces, but they didn't really have access to the scene.
Yeah.
And then the scene kind of just gets stuck, and there's no renewal, and like I think that's also so important for the continuation, and for like freshness, and for like life in any scene or community or whatever, is that there is some sort of I don't know, that there's space for new people to come in, and also that it the responsibility of keeping things going doesn't just stay on a handful of people's shoulders. It's so important that kind of shifts and moves around, and new people take on carrying it on and keeping things going.
Yeah.
But it took a while. Like, I mean, it's a venue in a residential basement, so maybe it, I don't know, kind of goes without saying that it would just be all ages, or like,
yeah,
it isn't a space that has to make money to survive, and the way to do that is to sell alcohol or whatever. So there's no overhead, there's no need for anything for it to work other than just like people coming in and doing stuff. But still, it was still always important to me that it be stated that this is a knowledge space, and to clarify that. But still, it took like 7 or 8 months for it to for that to really mean anything. Or I mean, like, I don't know how many shows I did, but the people that were coming to the shows were still all of drinking age, and then it just took like one teenager to come to some random show, and he goes home after the show and calls his friends and, you know, asks, have you been to the space? You have to check it out. And from that it kind of like grows, and then shows after that were flooded with teens that needed the space but didn't have it until then.
That must have felt very cool, having had that experience when you were that age, to then be able to provide that to the next generation.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And it was so I don't know, and in the first year or something of doing shows there, I could really I really felt this, like, at most shows there were a bunch of people that just came because they just showed up because there was a show there. It didn't really matter what the show was. It just kind of became this, like, they're just, there's a show there tonight, and it's happening there, so it must be something that, or it's just a place that I want to be in. And it didn't necessarily matter what was going on. And in the beginning it was mostly I don't think that's entirely true, but I've often said that it was mostly like kind of born out of the punk and metal scene, and that was most of the shows that took place there. But then I think back to the first few shows, and they were actually quite open from the beginning. But a lot of the regulars were kind of people from those scenes, but they would come to shows even if it wasn't necessarily a hardcore show, and they would see things that they probably wouldn't have otherwise. And that's also super cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool that you have this, I want to talk about the community around the venue and around you. But one of the things that I think is cool about it is the fact that there is this just kind of trust that like what you're doing is cool. Like, there's just this kind of base understanding of like, we have our trust in this person and in this space and in this community to produce something that's going to be interesting or relevant, and also just this capacity that I think has been kind of lost in live music in more recent years. Maybe it's a post-pandemic thing, maybe it's because of rising cost of things, but it's this willingness to take a risk on a show or band and think that you will get some kind of enjoyment out of not enjoying it, in a way, of going to something that challenges you or that might not be your type of thing, that you can go away and still enjoy with engaging with it critically, rather than necessarily being like, that was my favorite band and I loved every second of that. And I think one of the values of spaces like our 6013 is that they are accessible enough, and the it's often pay what you can, and so then you have the opportunity to be like, wow, I have no idea what this is, but I'm just going to check it out anyway. Yeah.
And I think also it has, by not being a bar or by not being, a space that anyone has any business going to except for the show that's happening, people come to see the show and they're not standing by the bar drowning out the show.
Yeah.
Which is an issue I've had, as a sound engineer working in other spaces. And like, if you don't feel like watching the band that's playing, you can stay outside and have your conversation there. But if you're in the room, it's a way more engaged audience than in most places.
And do you get that feedback from the bands that play there? Like, are they commenting on that being different from the other kinds of venues that they're playing?
Yeah, totally. And it's also, I don't know, to many people felt like kind of a safe space to try new things, or some people find it intimidating to be so close to their audience, but also there's just something, that closeness also, the closeness and the connection and like the engagement kind of breaks down the barrier of like, it's not like you're an artist putting on a show for someone else and it has to be perfect and you can't fuck up because then it's ruined. Like, I don't know, there have been many moments where I think it's easier to fuck up in a space like that because everyone's kind of just with you in it, and it's not necessarily like it's they're often just like funny little moments, and you get like an immediate reaction, and like, I don't know, there's an understanding. It's not like everything has to be perfect. It's just kind of like a,
yeah, I think that
I don't know,
yeah, that space, that freedom, environments where you can do that are so important to creativity.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking a lot in preparation for talking to you about the sorts of music that people make based on the space that they have access to, or the sort of art that people make based on the spaces they have access to kind of widen this thought. But, you often hear about, if we stick with music, about bands who start, I mean, like, okay, let's take the Beatles as like, you know, the example of the music that they made when they played in small underground venues, like you're one.
Yeah.
And then as they rose in popularity, the music that they made when they were expected to fill stadiums, because the music that they made at first did not work really in the stadium setting. Like no one could really connect with it in that space. And it really, there's lots of reasons why you could say that their music changed, but that's one of the ideas that's posited, is like you have access to a space, to an environment, and that is one of the creative constraints that can sometimes hold you back and sometimes boost your artistic output or your creative output. And I wonder, like, just by having access to a space that's so kind of formed around this idea of you can be experimental, like how much that's contributing to, I mean, you're starting with seeing, you know, you're creating this space, you're putting bands on there, but then I imagine you're immediately kind of getting collaborations you wouldn't expect, or connections that are being built by the fact that people are just in this environment mixing and talking to each other.
Yeah, totally. And one of the bands that I'm in just started from all of us happening to be at a show there where two of the people in the band were playing in separate bands. And I think it's also been important to me to kind of mix scenes and bring together kind of different types of music. I don't know, I think it's healthy for people to leave their bubble and not just go see their friends and the stuff that they know they like. So I like putting together shows with bands or artists that are way different from one another.
Because you almost always have like a few people on the bill each night.
I found 3 bands for a night is kind of the golden number, I think. But often there are shows where with more or occasionally less than that. But that gives you kind of a space to, I don't know, it just doesn't have to be 3 punk bands. It could be a punk band and a singer-songwriter and an electronic person that might on the surface sound completely different, but often make more sense than you think. And also I think that has more potential for growth in so many senses. And like, I don't know, if you're a punk band and you always play with other 5 punk bands in town, and for those bands' friends and fans, there's not that much room to grow your audience and find new people to reach. And I don't know. But then there's I've been thinking about the like community around the space, and I think in the beginning I really felt like there was like a kind of a specific community around the venue, that there were people that came to most shows, or like I could kind of do whatever and always felt like someone would show up. And I think that has changed over the years. It's been almost 8 years of doing this now.
What do you think has like precipitated that change? Is this a COVID thing? Is this like a change in the scene, the music scene in Reykjavik in general? Like,
I think it's a lot of different things at play. I don't know. I've had times where I really struggled with this, and I don't know, because for a time I felt like there was a specific group of people that came to most things, and when I stopped seeing those people as much, I kind of grieved that for a bit. But I don't know, I had been doing this for 2 years, and then I was just kind of burning out and working a job and trying to do shows on the side, and that kept growing, and that's where I wanted to be. So when I was working, that's where I had a hard time just being at work, and my mind was always reaching elsewhere. So I eventually quit my job and started this Patreon thing, and for a while that kind of exploded very early, and that's was like a way for the community around the space to contribute to what was happening there in some way, and allowed me to, for a year or two, that was enough to sustain me and keep doing this. And I was doing this quite actively, and I think in those years I did 30 or 40 shows a year, so sometimes like almost a show every week or stuff like that. But I think in that time I also, because I was getting paid by the community, I felt this kind of responsibility towards the community of like delivering and keeping things going and like always having something going on. And I think maybe I don't know if I overreached, or I was just eager to try new things, and I never really wanted to like book the same show twice. So I was trying to kind of reach outside of the people that I knew and the people that were playing there all the time. And somewhere in that time, and this was before COVID, this was maybe in the year before, there was a while where it was always packed, and there was people lining up outside the door wanting to get in, and people telling me that I needed a bigger space, and then at some point that kind of dissipated, and there were many shows where there were very few people, and then came COVID, and there was this just kind of like reset, and I was just using the space for like creative things, and then it turned more into a studio, and we used it differently. It took a while to get it going again, but I think in the time since COVID that I've kind of mostly just come to terms with the changes in that feeling of community that I had, and I think the space has also grown immensely, and the community has grown quite organically, and it's maybe less connected in a way, or it's like connected in a different way. And I think at this point the community is just kind of the music scene, and the space serves a wide variety of different communities. And just like with the bands that I was playing in when I was 15 that didn't really fit into the punk scene or didn't really fit into the metal scene, but also belonged to both, I think the same is kind of true of the space, is that I can book a punk show there and there will be 50 people running around in the little space that they have, or someone writes me and wants to put together a free jazz trio, and people will also show up for that. It'll likely be mostly different people, but sometimes there's overlap, and I don't know, it's just I think I also just have different expectations, and I've had a few noise shows there where 5 people show up, and it's great, and those 5 people are there for that show, and I think the amount of people that show up to a show is not the deciding factor, or what tells you. I don't think that's what tells you if a space has value or is important or not. I think that's kind of irrelevant. Although that's might be necessary in most cases for things to continue and to live on. I don't think that's the most important thing in valuing the art that's being made there or the community that lives there.
I mean, when you've got the opportunity to, one of the reasons why other spaces go off of that metric to decide value is because that is directly correlated with the financial incentive to put on events.
Yeah.
And when you have the opportunity to consider things differently. I'm quite interested then what does become the value. When someone writes to you and wants to put a band on, or when you think about who you want to platform, what becomes the deciding curatorial factors in terms of making that decision? Like, how do you decide what your values are, and how does that impact how you use the space?
It's a very good question that I don't know the answer to that. It's just a feeling, and I think maybe the most important thing is whether the artist is true to themselves. It's probably, and I don't think it's something like immediately identifiable or like something that I can say like this works or this doesn't. But I think mostly it's like kind of a question of I don't know. It's hard to say. I think if this is a space that you want to play in, it's probably a space you belong in, and would be open to you. I think it's quite, I don't know. I remember a band that they had members that really wanted to play this space, and they had other members that asked, but what would that tell people about us if we play this basement venue? Is that the band that we are? And I think they were maybe striving for a kind of like professionalism, or like, I don't know, wanting to be a bigger band, and bigger bands don't play basements. But what does that tell us about that band?
Yeah,
I don't know. I've had bands from abroad that are used to playing like 10 times bigger spaces, but that's the space that we have for them there, and they love it. And that's it's. I've often heard that those are some of their tour's best shows, and it's kind of like, in a way, it's like going back to the roots or something. But I also think it's just like, I honestly think it is the best way to experience live music.
Yeah, up close and personal, and
yeah, and like, I don't know, when I go to big shows with thousands of people, and you know the band on stage is hundreds of meters away, and can hardly see them, and I definitely cannot connect with them.
Mm-hmm. You're watching a screen rather than...
and it's just not an ideal way to experience this thing that can be so powerful. And I think it can be like way, I mean, sure, being, you know, around thousands of people experiencing the same thing that's important to you in many different ways is also powerful. But I think like the connection with like band and audience, I don't think there's a better way than in this like intimate, close space where you can do it together. I don't know, be in it together.
I mean, I think when you're saying about these bands who are coming from abroad and really love it, I do think there is something that's a bit easier sometimes for artists who are coming to a city that they don't know so well, and they have different expectations of like the spaces that they'll be in. And I think a lot of artists in Iceland are feeling the struggle of a lack of venue spaces in general.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that you're saying that your audience or your community has changed from being kind of a specific community to more like the music scene in general. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's related to the fact that the scene itself is just so much smaller, that every venue is precious and everyone would consider going to every space, because wherever you can see the bands or the music that you like, is relevant.
Right. Yeah.
But also, I mean, in general, what do you think the relationship is between DIY venues and spaces like your one and the kind of wider, more mainstream music culture I suppose I'm asking about Iceland specifically, but if you want to think more broadly about that, then that's however you want to approach that.
Can you tell me the question again?
I'm wondering about the relationship between
DIY
spaces and the mainstream music culture.
Right.
Not necessarily venues, but just like I'm also often, I think we're seeing polarization in so many ways these days. And the way that different people in arts and culture are like, whether you want to pitch yourself as like a bigger band or whether or not you're doing it through TikTok or whether you're, there's all these different ways in which to try and find your crowd, your audience.
Right.
But I've always been kind of surprised by the extremity of the separation in Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
There are artists that are huge here that I would never personally recognize any of their music because I don't listen to the one radio station that plays that.
Yeah.
And vice versa. Like so are there crossover points between these different streams of culture? And is there ways in which these different versions of the music scene as a whole are feeding into each other?
I don't know. I think there are. I'm just having a hard time grabbing the thought that I have. I don't know. I had a conversation fairly recently. I was talking about grassroots in music and kind of trying to identify what that means, what grassroots is, and like talking about this concert series that was happening and what would be important to keep in mind for the next round of concerts. And to some people it's like, well, we have to get more young people to play these shows. And there were shows in this like grassroots concert series where it was only people over 25 or 30 or something. But I don't think, while I do think that this like renewal and like getting young people involved is very important, I don't think that's what grassroots means. And I think it's not like grassroots is like something that starts small and then, eventually or not makes it to, the goal, which is to be not grassroots anymore, but to be, successful and accessible to the public. But I think like it's much rather just kind of like a fertile ground for like things to come out of. And some of those things will kind of stay in the roots and on the fringes, and some of those things will go elsewhere. And grassroots can be, a lot of different things for different parts of the music scene. But I think a lack of that, a lack of like a rich grassroots scene in like a general sense, is a unfortunate, possibly quite sad thing for like a general like musical landscape or something. It's like I don't know what I'm getting at here.
I think I know partially what you mean anyway, without trying to put words in your mouth, but like there has to be something for everyone, and there has to be space, like we were saying before, to have this freedom of creativity. And that doesn't mean necessarily that someone from a very mainstream background or someone who's very established in that space is going to come and play in our 6013. But even just the fact that all of these different spaces exist mean that there's a lot of opportunity to think about music from lots of different angles, and creativity from lots of different angles. And there's a kind of safety in knowing that you can find your place in the music scene.
Exactly.
Regardless of which path you want to go down, regardless if you continue to have interaction with, people working on these different levels, there is a feeling like you're part of an enriched environment means that you do whatever stream you pick better because of this kind of confidence in a broader landscape in general.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I don't know. And I was I was thinking about this, the amount of people that come to a show is not what determines its value or something. And I felt this very strongly and started thinking about this more because I had to turn in like a, what do you call it? Report for some grant that I had received. And the last question is on the report is about how many people has this project influenced or had an impact on or touched or whatever. And I just think it's kind of a weird question to ask, and made me feel like I have to exaggerate or to inflate the numbers of whatever that I'm doing to make it seem more important to the deciding powers.
Yeah, because even the premise of that, like, okay, you've let's say 50 people come to one show,
yeah,
and it's the only time they ever engage with the space, versus one person comes to a show where there's 5 people at and like finds their whole new group of friends and or starts a band and it starts coming every week. Then that's one person who's had a completely different experience of impact.
Yeah.
So as a metric, it's kind of tricky.
Yeah. And I just don't think it makes sense in this regard. And it's like, I don't know. But that's some people just understand numbers.
Yeah. No, sorry, go on.
No, I don't think I have more to say. I do think I have to run, actually.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. I've had I'm going to go on thinking about this a lot, especially in terms of that, how we ask community spaces and community leaders to measure or talk about the impact of their work. And I think that relates a lot to the way that East of Moon wants to engage with communities. So thank you so much for your time. I'll put all of your links down in the description. And if you want to go and see a really cool show in Reykjavik, I recommend R6013.
Yeah. Takk fyrir mig.